a commercial office building, a free-to-the-public three-story garden, and an architectural feat. All of these terms were used to describe 20 Fenchurch Street before construction was completed in 2014. Now, nearly 8 years later, it has coined a few new terms: deceitful, dangerous, and the worst building in London. My name is Ava Gordon, and I am accompanied by my team members and fellow civil engineers Nora Rickman, PJ Quinn, and Luke Marty. Our goal is to provide background on this building, inform you on the events that led to its poor reputation, dive into the ethics around what occurred, and lastly, analyze the risks that it poses. 20 Fenchurch Street is located in central London and was designed by architect Raphael Vannucci. His goal was to create a building that was able to blend the functionality of a modern-day office building with the beauty and accessibility of a public park. The top 3 stories of this building make up a sky garden which aimed to be free to the public. The unique top-heavy shape of this building was created in order to increase the size of the floors as the building got taller. Shortly after construction began in 2010, the building was nicknamed the Walkie-Talkie Building due to its close resemblance to a walkie-talkie. But within a few years of construction, issues began to arise, leading it to receive a new nickname: the Walkie Scorchie Building.
This skyscraper, located in central London, took about 5 years to be constructed, and then it was opened in January of 2015. This is around the time when locals started complaining about the intense heat that they were feeling when they would go next to the building. This is caused from the concave shape that you can see on the screen that does resemble a walkie-talkie. And when the sun is high enough in the sky, the sun rays reflect off of the building and create a very intense beam that then goes down to the street level. This beam is very, very hot, and it is very intense and bright. Locals started calling it the death ray. So on the next slide, we'll go into more issues that have arose from this intense light beam. So now we'll go into a couple different issues that have arose from the Walkie Scorchie building. The first one, kind of the most obvious, is the intense heat that was created from the death beam that we talked about on the previous slide. This beam of light can get up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit at street level. There was a car parked outside of the building, and you can see in the top picture that it completely melted their mirror. So this beam is very intense, and there was also a reporter that fried an egg on the sidewalk. So you can see that in the bottom left picture as well. So this beam of light is also 6 times brighter than normal sunlight, so it's a very just intense area for certain times of the day. Then another issue that is created from this is it creates a wind tunnel. This is caused from a downdraft effect. So when wind hits the concave building, the wind is then shoved down to the street level and creates very intense gusts of wind. Locals have complained about this and said that they have almost gotten blown over from this wind. Then lastly, there's an issue with the architect. His name is Raphael Vannucci. He has a history of building commercial buildings like this. So there was another one in Las Vegas. It's a hotel that had this same concave design and also created intense beam of light where people sitting by the pool claimed that like their water bottles would melt next to it and it would singe their hair. So his past also is being reflected in this project since he has done this before. A public garden was promised to the people of central London during the proposal phase of this building. There is a couple pictures on the screen here where you can see what this looks like. The critics of this area say that it looks more like an airport terminal rather than a public garden. And personally, to me, it looks like it's a restaurant with just plants in the background. There's a lot more gray area than a green area, and in no way would I think that this is a public garden. I would think it's just a fancy restaurant. So some other issues with this is that the public, to even use it, they have to book it 3 days in advance. to go up in this area, then past 6 p.m. only people that are dining in the restaurant are able to go in this area. So this is an issue because during the proposal, this is not what the developer promised. So locals are a little upset that it's not the public garden that they wanted in their community.
So now that you have a general idea of all that's happened with the Walkie Scorchie building, now let's talk about some of the ethical problems that came with it. Now, most of the ethical problems that arose in this just are a factor of oversight. As engineers, we have a responsibility for not only the ethics of what we are doing, but also how it affects the world around us and the things around us. And now, while Raffaele Vinoli may not have been an engineer, he was an architect, that does not mean he's exempt from any of these rules. It also doesn't mean that the engineers who were on his team who helped him design and build this building should not have taken notice of what these effects are. Additionally, when in the construction of this building, he had a responsibility to the past, and there's ethics in that too. As we discussed before, when he designed his building in Las Vegas, that also came with many problems. The building had a problem of heating things up and melting plastic, so it is foolish to assume that he should not have looked into that and how that problem could have gone into a building like this that had a similar design. By ignoring the ethics of the past and what has happened in your past, you are being unethical. Now we go into more of the ethics of the surroundings, and this is what it comes into of just as engineers, we can't take notice just of what we are doing. We have to be fully aware of how the things we do affect the world around us in whole. In this case, it led to destruction of property. When you get to temperatures that are as high as it created from this, death ray, it could have been so much worse. And finally, we have a responsibility to ourselves. For Raffaele Vinoli, he had a responsibility to himself and also to the company that hired him to build this building. Because of the problems he created by ignoring these ethics and choosing not to look at the surroundings around him, he really created problems that cost millions of dollars. He also created a problem for himself, as when you do something like this, your name will forever be known as the person who created this massive failure of a building. We face another major ethical problem in this building. Now, this time it doesn't so much come from the construction of the building versus how they handled their public garden on top. I'm sure at a very young age you learned about how important it is to keep your promises. I'm sure your parents instilled in you the idea of you're only as good as your word. Now, unfortunately, in businesses today, that's not always the case. Many businesses will try and pull a fast one on you or tell little white lies so that they can keep their promise without lying, but also get away with something. In the same way, I feel like this garden fits into that category. You see, as we discussed before, it's not so much a garden, and it doesn't really qualify as public. And while they kept their promises of what they're trying to build in their definition, that does not mean that it was ethically done. And I think anytime you try and pull a fast one on the people you are creating something for, you really face a major ethical problem.
The ethical issues that arose from the building's design and construction immediately created risk for many people. Almost immediately after the completion of the construction, people began to notice the death ray effect on the streets below. This drew a lot of attention to the building itself, and it quickly began to receive a lot of negative press. The death ray drew attention to many of the other building's problems, like the fact that it is simply an eyesore to many, hence why the building was given the Carbuncle Cup Award in 2015. And as previously mentioned, another problem the building created that may not have been noticed were it not for the solar glare problem was the downdraft effect that was experienced at street level. And finally, the rooftop sky garden was criticized as being more like an airport terminal than London's highest public park. And there are many issues with the building beyond these few, and it continued to receive publicity issues for several years following the completion of the construction. But all this negative attention drawn to the building called for many immediate changes. Mere weeks after the death ray effect was first noticed, the developers were responsible for installing multiple solutions to mitigate the solar glare problem. And the first of these changes was that 3 parking spaces on the street were suspended to prevent more damage to personal vehicles. And in one instance, developers had to pay over $1,000 to the owner of a Jaguar whose car was damaged from the solar glare off the building. The developers also had to devise a temporary solution to the solar glare, and what they came up with was a scaffolding structure with a sunscreen that would be placed at street level to minimize the impact of the glare on that area. And despite the compensation that the developers had to pay for the architect's design mistake, the solar glare issue did nothing to deter lettings. And as a matter of fact, 20,000 square feet was taken up in just a few months after the problem materialized. And the tenancy contracts that were signed prior to the building's construction were left unaffected after the solar glare problem was discovered. And this really goes to show that regardless of the poor attention that the building received, the developers were still able to practically fully benefit from the construction of one of London's ugliest buildings. And in the long run, the ethical dilemma created by the building's solar glare issue was one that the developers, the architects, and the public would have preferred to completely prevent in the first place. Only a few months after the building was completed, a permanent solution was finally installed to replace the scaffolding that was at ground level. The developer decided to construct a sunscreen permanently from the 3rd to 44th floors to diffuse sunlight. And this project actually added nearly $15 million to the final cost of the building, but it fortunately ended the solar glare problem for good. But the public sentiment of the building hasn't seemed to have improved since it was completed, and it's very obvious that the building sticks out from London's skyline like a sore thumb, and many people consider it to be an eyesore. But even with the negative impacts the building suffered through all of the bad publicity, 20 Fenchurch is still a very, very valuable piece of property. A very good example of this fact is that the building was sold for $1.7 billion to a Hong Kong food-based cooking company in 2017, blah, 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 recording. In the long run, the ethical dilemma created by the building solar glare issue was one that the developers, architects, and the public would have preferred to completely prevent in the first place. Only a few months after the building was completed, a permanent solution to replace the temporary scaffolding was planned, and the developer decided to construct a permanent sunscreen from the 3rd to 34th floors of the building to diffuse sunlight through a series of aluminum fins. And this project added nearly $15 million to the final cost of the project, which is, again, something that the developers and architects would have preferred to completely prevent. In the long run, the ethical dilemma created by the building's solar glare issue is one that the developers, architects, and the public would have preferred to completely prevent in the first place. Only a few months after the building was completed, a permanent solution to replace the temporary scaffolding at ground level was already in planning stages. The developer decided to construct a series of aluminum fins to act as a permanent sunscreen between the 3rd and 34th floors to diffuse sunlight. And though this ended the solar glare issue for good, it added nearly $15 million to the final cost of the building. But regardless of the fix, the public sentiment of the building was permanently damaged, and it hasn't seemed to have changed from when it was completed. It sticks out like a sore thumb from London's skyline, and many people still consider it to be an eyesore. But even through the bad publicity that the building suffered, 20 Fenchurch is still a very valuable piece of property, especially because it sits in London's financial district. But a very good example of this, of the cost of the building, is that it sold for nearly $1.7 billion to a Hong Kong-based cooking ingredients company. And according to CNN Business, this price set the record for the largest sale price for a single office building in the United Kingdom. So all in all, the challenges that the Walkie Scorchie faced in the months and years following its construction have not seemed to affect what the building was worth in the long run. And unfortunately, the public suffers the most from this ethical dilemma, while the developers are able to fully reap the benefits of a new, fully let office building in the heart of London. But a lesson can be learned from the mistakes made while constructing Walkie Scorchie.
Most anything that could go wrong did go wrong with 20 Fincard Street. From the initial deception of the accessibility of this public building to the literal melting of cars, and most recently, the formation of overpowering wind tunnels. When a large-scale building like this has so many issues, it is extremely necessary to try and pinpoint the person or people that were at the root of these issues. In this case, that was the head architect Raphael Vanulli and his team of head engineers and consultants. The oversights of these individuals have resulted in high risk for the citizens who are frequently around this building. While temporary and small solutions have been put into place, it's not out of line to wonder when the next problem with this famously hated building will occur. Thank you all for listening, and we urge you to look further into this architectural disaster with the sources provided.